92nd Street Y online media is made possible by a generous gift in memory of Christopher Lightfoot Walker, longtime friend of 92Y's Unterberg Poetry Center and the Paris Review. This program, part of an ongoing collaboration between the Poetry Center and the Review, features a Writers at Work interview with Czeslaw Milosz. It was recorded on October 4th, 1993, before a live audience at New York's 92nd Street Y.
Good evening and welcome. We're going to try to do a little bit of the impossible tonight, and we're happy to have Mr. Milosz talking to us about many aspects of his work and thought. This is part of an ongoing series of conversations for the Paris Review Writers at Work series. So we might as well start with beginnings. Many poets return to aspects of their childhood in their writing, and works that they read in their childhood recur frequently in their writing. What kinds of books were important to you as a child, and what kind of influence do they continue to have in your work?
Well, let us imagine a world without radio, without television, and without film. That was my childhood in a provincial part of Europe, in Lithuania. And the impact of books much stronger. And I profited from the library of my grandfather, which was largely composed by books of the 19th century. The only geographic atlas had a big white spot in the middle of Africa. And so my readings were largely 19th century still. And I discovered certain very serious themes. The mystery of time was revealed to me not by Marcel Proust, but by Fenimore Cooper. And I must say that some authors like Fenimore Cooper were very popular in garbled versions for children. For instance, the whole epic of Deerslayer and so on, the whole series, condensed into one volume, made upon me a tremendous impression, because it was really the mystery of a young hunter gradually changing into a mature man and into an old man towards the end of the book. And he constantly moving from the east to west, to west. So the end is the prairie when he's old man, and so it's somehow parallels the march of America. His tragedy is that he is a pioneer and he escapes civilization at the same time. So that was a book which made a great impression upon me. And besides books about America written by authors who have never heard of in America, like Thomas Maine Reid, who was, well, I have written an essay once, and I tried to find out about him. He was an Irishman who spent some time in America, was a hunter, teacher, and so on, and then made a career as author of books for children in London. And so his books where every name of a plant and animal, bird, was provided with a Latin name. That was for me crucial. And I became, at a given moment, an ornithologist. I knew all the names of birds with their Latin equivalents. Such authors as Karl May, who was beloved by all children all over Europe, translated into all European languages but unknown in America, a German who wrote his novels of adventures sitting in a prison for debts in Germany. So those, then later came another phase when I lived in Vilna, and when I saw films, and my education in this respect was like American children, my contemporaries. All those actors, Mary Pickford, Lillian Gish, Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, and so on.
Wasn't your favorite Greta Garbo?
Greta Garbo?
Yes.
Later. So, you see, it's very difficult. You ask me about books in childhood. It's very difficult to draw a line when our childhood ends and when reading the adults' books begins. Because at first there is a lot of books for grown-up people, and we are surrounded as if by chiaroscuro area. We don't understand, and so on. Gradually we start to understand. So that's that passage. But I must mention one thing more, that because of my rural and provincial childhood and because of those books from the library of the 19th century, I was absolutely entranced by books on nature with illustrations, woodcuts, colored woodcuts. That fashion was in Europe, but also in America, Audubon, Alexander, and so on. So that it was parallel. Beautiful illustrations. And of course, I guess that it defined largely my attitude towards nature.
Well, you initially intended to become a naturalist. This seems to be your passion in school, in your early years of school. Yeah. And you were even very interested in forestry. What fascinated you about naturalism, and then what led you away from it?
I guess I was fascinated, first of all, by names, by naming. My great hero was Linnaeus, who
you have a poem to him in prose.
Who named species and so on. But I was also a hunter because of my father who was a hunter. And I was killing birds, killing animals. Today I am deeply ashamed. I would never do that. Mm-hmm. But at the time I was doing that, and I was a taxidermist. I knew how to take skin from a bird and remodel and so on. But my basic decision not to become a naturalist, I guess, was discovery of cruelty in nature. And in high school, I was, I guess, 14 maybe. I discovered Darwin and whole polemics about natural selection and so on, and even I was giving speeches in our club of naturalists on that. And
speeches on Darwin in a Catholic
on Darwin,
Catholic school.
It was not a Catholic school. It was however, the priest was a very important person, but it was a state school. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what led you, and so the cruelty led you away from this?
Yes, I guess so. But the habits of hunting and observing nature, it stayed with me, or maybe just a passion for names, for capturing nature by names. Or maybe those books which I mentioned with colored woodcuts. Nature is much more beautiful in painting, in my opinion.
And stuff. When did you first think of becoming a writer? Or when did you first know you were going to be a poet?
I started to write when I was in high school, but it was not an effort to express myself. Those were exercises of form, very cool. And I guess influenced by some French poets of La Pléiade in my French textbook. It would be difficult to tell that I wanted to be a poet. I wanted to be something of the sort in a conflict with my surroundings, namely with a negative attitude, what Flaubert called hatred of the bourgeois. And so I wanted to have a different style, different way of life. So maybe that's the closest. Oh. Sorry. I would improve my ways now.
Early on, you were part of a literary group known as Zagari, and they practiced something called catastrophism, or they were catastrophists. What were their ideals, and what made you become a founder?
You formulate that in a way that I joined a group which was called Catastrophist. Not at all. I was co-founder of that group. And we didn't know that we are catastrophists. That was a name applied later by literary critics. Those were years 1931, 32, 33. And I asked myself a question: to what extent a dark vision of history is a result of personal inclination to pessimism, and to what extent personal inclination to pessimism reflects an aura of historical period. Certainly those things are connected very closely. And that was a horrible period in Europe. And undoubtedly, the influence of literature was considerable. At that time, as a student, I was an avid reader. Novels from neighboring countries were translated into Polish and published in cheap editions. Plays also, for instance, from Germany, Weimar Republic, were published. So literature which was coming from the Weimar Germany was pessimistic, nihilistic, sarcastic, full of hatred. The same literature coming from the Soviet Union, Soviet literature of the 1920s, before the introduction of socialist realism, was extremely cruel, negative. There were writers like Seyfulina and others. Not mentioning Ilya Ehrenburg, who lived at that time in Paris, and his nihilistic novels were translated into Polish immediately. There were, excuse me, there's an echo?
You're okay.
Yeah. I am uneasy with that machine. So the mood of literature was very pessimistic, very, very negative. And at the same time, political news were awful. That was the time of Stalinism in Russia and Hitler coming to power in Germany. And understanding of that, of course, influenced our group. I should mention also that a man who was rector of our university, an old professor, Marian Zdziechowski, was an utter pessimist, and he wrote a book entitled W obliczu końca, Facing the End, where he predicted that soon Europe will be destroyed by two forces, nationalism and communism. Fortunately, he died in 1939, just before it started. So those, and of course, Polish pessimistic authors had a great part in that. There was Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz, extremely catastrophist, pessimistic author. So our poetry expressed enormous foreboding. We didn't know clearly what would happen, but those catastrophist accents were very strong. And some poems written by our group were kind of surrealistic prophecy of horrors to come. So we conceived that in a rather cosmic catastrophe than clearly defined political catastrophe. And then later, under the German occupation in the Nazi-occupied Warsaw, there was a group of very young poets who took over certain motives, but for them, of course, the fulfillment was the Nazi occupation. But for us, no, it was not so precise. It extended further.
What was the attitude of that group toward earlier poetic form? What kind of experimentation?
It seems to me that a poetry of every language is largely determined by linguistic aspects of proper characteristics of a given language. In Poland, that was a time of experimentation and, in fact, abandoning already metrical pattern and rhyme. Not so in Russia. In Russian poetry till today, if we take Josip Brodsky, his very far-reaching experimentation, linguistic experimentation is within the framework of classical meter and rhyme. But we were at that time experimenting and either writing in traditional meter or departing, applying so-called free verse, if such a thing as free verse exists.
Why do you make that qualification? What do you think is a misnomer about that?
Because the rhythmical pattern is also present in so-called free verses, in metrical verse.
During the war years, you were part of the resistance in Warsaw. You published or contributed to a clandestine anthology of poetry against the Nazis. What effect did the war years have on your poetry?
I continued to write, and I was very uneasy because I noticed that something is wrong. Something was wrong, namely the form was pre-war form, let us say. I understood that the reality is completely different from what poetry, literature was prepared to cope with. And I looked for something. I didn't know for a long time. I discovered that more or less around 1943, I started to write poetry, more or less coping with reality. which was awful. But at the same time, in 43, I have written a long poem composed by short poems entitled The World, a naive poem, which maybe I was not aware at that time to the extent I am aware now of that. That was like Blake's songs of innocence opposed to songs of experience. I consider that the world was so horrible that against that something should be written which would bring back honor to the world. And those childish poems were answers. The world as it should be, not as it is, as it was. So those were double search, this one way, and another poems like poems of poor people about the Nazi occupation.
After the war years, you eventually broke with the communist regime. You were an attaché for the communist government. But you returned to Paris as an emigre. And in your poem, Bypassing Rue Descartes, you describe it as a city in which many espoused beautiful ideas, phrase you used. What was your sense of the intellectual climate in Paris, and how did you respond to it?
Well, that was certainly not a place to be for somebody who came from Eastern Europe. Because I lived through two phases in Paris. I lived through a period when I was an attaché of the Polish embassy, and I attended parties with Éluard, Aragon, Pablo Neruda, and so on. And then I have to live as a refugee. At that time, French intellectuals were completely in love with communism and with Stalin. And of course, somebody who came from the East, dissatisfied, was considered a madman or just an agent of Americans. Unfortunately, it was not true. And it was, I was looking at so-called les idées générales of Frenchmen, because they have always ambition to invent ideas valid for the whole planet. And the ideas were beautiful, but they didn't fit reality. At that time, the climate, that was 1950, 1951. The climate in Europe was horrible, as if those millions of people in gulags, that their suffering, as if it contaminated the aura, the air of whole Europe. And I knew all those things. They had to wait for Solzhenitsyn, I guess, Gulag Archipelago, to learn about all that. And this is not a secret after all. I was in trouble. In Warsaw, they took me my passport. They didn't want to release me, going back to Paris for my job, their diplomatic job. And a woman who is no more alive, Russian, by the way, who was wife of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, a communist, very zealous communist, said, well, in my opinion, a poet should stay with his country. But if you decide otherwise, remember that you have a duty to fight against the executioner of Russia. To say such a thing then was very dangerous thing. So I felt obligation, let us say. But intellectual climate, you see, I was a friend of Albert Camus, and that was, to be a friend of Albert Camus was gave a completely different perspective on Jean-Paul Sartre and his crowd. That was the time when they were after Camus and trying to destroy him. Because his book, L'Homme Révolté, The Rebel, where he mentioned that in the Soviet Union there are concentration camps. So you have here the sample of aura. People who would be able to translate me refused because they said that they would be ostracized themselves if they translated. So I was in a difficult position then.
And was that the time when I think both you and Camus were somewhat under the influence of, or very interested in the writings of Simone Weil?
Yes, yeah.
What effect did she have?
A basic effect, I guess, was that thanks to her, I discovered the role of contradiction. Contradiction, which is, as she called it, road to transcendence. I was full of contradictions. And for me, it was a kind of a liberation, a legitimate use of contradiction. Besides, that legitimate use of contradiction is in existentialism of Karl Jaspers. And I was influenced in a way by Karl Jaspers through a friend of mine, Jean Hersch, Professor Jean Hersch, who was a translator of Jaspers into French and former student of Jaspers, together with Hannah Arendt besides. And through her, I met Hannah Arendt in Paris. So the same, the problem of contradiction and the problem of taking, finding arguments against all the Hegelian stuff.
And this has become an essential element of your poetry?
No, it was a very bad element for a poet. Because I guess that you have a question about philosophical poetry.
Well, the question is, is poetry the proper realm for philosophy?
Yes, but it depends what kind of philosophy.
What kind of philosophy?
There are some kinds of philosophy which remind me of when you drive at night and a rabbit enters the lights and the rabbit runs and doesn't know how to get out of that ray of car. There are some kinds of philosophy like that. And undoubtedly, I have never been a party member, but I was influenced by, I was a leftist undoubtedly, since the time of my Vilna time. And so I had my Hegelian guru, and I was influenced. So I had to liberate myself from that. And I liberate gradually, but my poetry was not liberated immediately.
What do you think helped that liberation?
I have written a novel, The Issa Valley,
Yes.
to liberate myself. And that was a novel which had nothing political, really. It was about Lithuanian countryside. The action takes place in 1922, let us say. Something like that. And there are phantoms. There is a priest who has a mistress, and the mistress dies and commits suicide and starts to haunt the parish. And this summer still, I was there. And so the grave of that girl on the local cemetery, in the same church is there where I was baptized and where all those things happened. Plenty of phantoms of devils. But the Issa Valley is not just reminiscences of childhood. It's a philosophical novel in a way about cruelty in nature.
And since then you have been uninterested in writing novels. You seem to have a problem with the idea of the genre of the novel.
Yeah. I have been teaching Dostoevsky at Berkeley. So I had time to think about the novel as a literary genre. And I know there is one argument against writing novels. Dostoevsky was a born novelist. And a born novelist would sacrifice anything, doesn't know any obligations of honor. He would put everything in the novel. And Dostoevsky created a character of the idiot of General Ivolgin, who is a liar, tells told stories. He tells how he lost his leg in war, and he buried his leg. And the inscription on the tomb is taken from the tomb of Dostoevsky's mother. This is a true novelist, but I couldn't.
Do you feel that, as in a way T.S. Eliot did, that poetry is an escape from personality?
Possibly, but one has constant problem of lying. Namely, I don't know what for, why. Literature is born out of a desire to be truthful, not to hide anything, and not to present oneself as somebody else. But when you write, there are laws of form. You cannot tell everything. There are laws of form. Of course, I can say that today perhaps it's not true because people tell such things that they have no restraint. But I consider that the law of form imposes certain restraints. And then you have a feeling that you didn't unveil yourself enough. A book appears and you feel that, well, next time I would unveil myself. So, and next book appears, you have the same feeling. And then the life ends and this is.
In bypassing Rue Descartes, there is a confession of the violation of a taboo, which I think is really the core of the poem. And there are confessions in a number of your poems.
Yes.
Do you feel in that mode that there is a kind of the problem of an infinite regress of never being able to get to the ground of one's shame, not being able to get out of the cycle of self-recognition and self-abasement?
I don't know. I have never been psychoanalyzed. I am very skeptical as far as psychiatry is concerned. My dream is to be on a couch and to tell everything. But I know this is completely wrong because I wouldn't be able to, probably. And besides, it wouldn't lead to anywhere.
You have some objections to Wallace Stevens' phrase that the poem is an act of the mind. What are your objections to that notion?
You see, literature, also poetry, today are under an enormous pressure of a scientific way of thinking, empirical way of thinking. And I guess that Wallace Stevens is an example of a dissecting mind, very penetrating dissecting mind. And dissecting mind applied to poetry is wrong, I believe, because if we take a poem of Wallace Stevens on two pairs and attempt to describe two pairs as if taught to a Martian, to a creature from another planet, that's dissection. And I guess that an object, things of this world, should be rather contemplated than dissected. And this is sort of a detached attitude towards objects in Dutch still lifes, which were considered by Schopenhauer as the highest art. Contemplation. And also the problem of that contemplation in Japanese haiku poets, where there is, as Basho said, about the pine, you must learn from the pine. So this is a completely different attitude than dissecting the world.
I notice in your, you're putting together an anthology of poetry. You include many Asian poets. Is this a quality you see in a great deal of Asian poetry that you don't see in the West?
Yes.
Your friend, Gombrowicz, wrote of you, Milosz experiences strife, torment, and doubts that were completely unknown to writers formerly. Do you agree with him?
That what? Repeat.
Milosz, Gombrowicz says, Milosz experiences strife, torment, and doubts that were completely unknown to writers formerly. Do you agree with him, his assessment of you?
Yes, I agree, but he refers especially to my book, The Captive Mind. And he refers to my struggle with the demon of the century. The demon of the century was a belief, Hegelian belief in the historical necessity. In history, developing along the preordained lines. And I should say, I wrote that book, The Captive Mind, in order to liberate myself. And I had to find arguments in my forum internum against that philosophy. And that's probably what he calls my struggle, unknown before to writers.
You have an interesting, I don't want to call it poem because you qualify it at the end, called Ars Poetica, but it's Ars Poetica ?
Yes.
And in that you wrote that the purpose of poetry is to remind us how difficult it is to remain just one person. How does this notion affect the form and style of your poetry?
Yeah, my poetry has been called polyphonic poetry. Namely, I have always been full of voices speaking, and I considered myself in a way an instrument, a medium. My friend Jean Hersch, who initiated me into existentialism of Karl Jaspers, used to say, I have never seen a person so instrumental. Namely that I was visited by voices. It has nothing extraterrestrial in that. But in myself. And I wonder to what extent this is my proper quality of my psychophysical constitution, and to what extent it is a spirit of the epoch. Already Dostoevsky discovered, of course, a Russian theoretician, Mikhail Bakhtin, called Dostoevsky's novel polyphonic novels. I guess Dostoevsky was one of the first writers, together with Friedrich Nietzsche, of exceptional character of crisis of our civilization. In the sense that every one of us is visited by contradictory voices, contradictory theses, and urges. And his characters, Dostoevsky's characters, of course, are multi-voiced. At the same time, they hear, like for instance, in Notes from the Underground and so on. So that's why I wrote how difficult it is to remain the same person if guests enter and go and take us for their instrument. I say in the same poem, it's good if good spirits take us for instruments and not evil spirits.
In two poems, To Raja Rao, which was a response to a conversation, and a recent poem, I think, that appeared it appeared last November in the New Yorker, Capri, you make reference to waiting for the real presence. Is this suggest that poetry is a sacramental act, that we have invoked this presence?
Yes, I personally believe in reality of the world, in the sense that the world maybe is a skin of deeper reality, but it's there. It cannot be reduced to words. And this is my basic disagreement with some writers of this century.
Some argue that language is the ultimate reality, and others have argued that language is completely arbitrary. Where do you stand in that debate?
No, I do not think that that language is everything. Neither I believe that language is purely arbitrary. I guess that in human language there are some relationships and some relation to archetypal ideas or forms in the world. So certain words have a much deeper meaning than purely conventional meaning. So I would reject both arbitrariness of language, pure arbitrariness, and reducing the language to l'écriture, to language speaking itself.
In a prose poem in Provinces, A Philosopher's Home, you conclude with a possible attribute of God as acting with, quote, the passionate zeal of a photo reporter. Does this describe your ideal of God as witness, and is it an ideal of what the poet can try to do?
Yes, I guess so. I guess that a poet who exerted very strong influence upon me was Whitman.
Mm-hmm.
Whitman, because Whitman wanted to embrace everything, put everything. And we can forgive Walt Whitman, his enumerations, his streams, infinite streams of words and so on, because he strived so hard to embrace reality, as much reality as possible. And I guess it's somehow connected with my image of life after death, which would, like in Blake, should be infinite hunting.
And for you, both the hunter, the hunt, and the rabbit are quite real.
Yes. But you didn't ask me a question. You wanted to.
Oh,
About Vilna.
Yes. Vilna was the city of your youth, and it recurs in your writings. What effect did that city have, or still does it have upon your imagination?
Very, very durable effect. However, in my writing, when I found myself abroad, I tried to introduce my area, Vilna, Lithuania, and so on, to the Western readers. And I noticed enormous difficulty because that city changed the hands in this century 13 times, I guess. And it was like Sarajevo, namely various nationalities, various denominations, languages together. So it was like a lesson of anthropology, practical lesson. And for that reason, I am so deeply moved by what happens in Bosnia, in Sarajevo. I am deeply committed. I feel a horror because I understand all those ethnic conflicts. And that was a durable influence. And besides a provincial character of Vilna, I see enormous advantages of growing in a provincial town, provincial city. It gives a different, better perspective, perhaps.
It would certainly be different from the city in which we're seated now. I think at this point it would be good to offer the audience a chance to ask Mr. Milosz some questions. So please, raise your hand. Yes.
Could you please compare your perception of the world today with that in the 30s? Quite pessimistic about the world in the 30s, I understood from what you said. Could you compare your perception of the world today, and Europe in particular?
Could you compare, the question was,
Yes.
Could you compare your perception of the world today with that of the world in the 30s?
I cannot, because then I was 20. And now I'm over 80, so that's a great difference. And I wonder, what is the perception of the world today of a person of 20 years old? In any case, I noticed that those young people who write dissertations about that period over there, the time of my youth, have enormous difficulty in entering the skin of people who lived there then. Namely, to reconstruct that perspective. It's very difficult.
Yes. Could you talk a little bit about your writing process? Do you write in the morning? Do you write in the evening? Do you write on little pieces of paper? Do you keep notebooks? How many times do you revise your work? Drink coffee?
The last part was, do you drink coffee when you write?
Never, I never drink coffee. I never drink coffee and never use any stimulants. I like to drink alcohol, but after my work. And I write in the morning. Whether one line or more, I try to, only in the morning. Probably I am not neurotic because I do not write at night at all. But I don't know whether this is a sufficient criteria.
Do you revise a great deal?
What?
Do you revise your poems a great deal? Do you revise your poems a great deal?
There is no rule.
No rule.
Sometimes a poem is written in 5 minutes. Sometimes it takes months, a few months even. There is no rule.
Is your creative process in Polish or is it in English? Do you write first in Polish and then translate into English, or?
I write only in Polish. I have always written only in Polish because I consider that my mastery of the language is the best when I use the language of my childhood.
Yes.
Do you think your poetry can be translated well?
The question is, do you think your poetry can be translated well?
I translate mostly myself, and then friends of mine, mostly Robert Haas now or Leonard Nathan, they correct only. So, but basic rhythm is given by me, as they do not know even the Polish language. So I guess my poetry can be translated. I didn't expect it could be translated. I consider that there is a large spectrum of translatability of poetry. Some poetry is completely untranslatable, and I know because I have translated into English Polish poetry and vice versa. Some untranslatable, some translates very well. And I would place my poetry somewhere in the middle of this scale.
Has your awareness of an English-speaking audience come to have an effect, or your awareness of an international audience come to have an effect on your writing now? Whereas when you were younger, maybe you were writing principally for an audience in Poland or an expatriate audience.
Yeah, I must say that I feel very privileged that I can can have a communication with American audiences. I didn't believe it would be possible through reading poetry. And really, I am grateful to America because of that. In Western Europe, it doesn't exist. Reading poetry, public reading poetry. In Poland, yes. In Poland, I read in the original, of course, in Poland, in Polish. And I noticed very interesting differences in reaction, differences of the public. Very curious. So I have a possibility of comparing.
Could you discuss with any more detail your collaborative process with Robert Haas in particular and other translators? When you come up against a line or a thought that's untranslatable, do you simply leave that and try to translate as best you can?
With my co-translators. Yeah.
The question was to describe the process and interaction of Milosz with his translator.
Well, I guess a different process goes on if a co-translator knows the language. But I work with my co-translators who do not know the language of the original. So they rely only upon my version, and my version cannot be a rough version just in prose. I have to modulate every line. So my translations with them are practically my translations as to the rhythm. And they correct some idioms, some expressions which are not American enough or something like that. So their role is limited. Or, like some poems in my collected poems, those were three persons, Robert Piński, Robert Haas, and Renata Gorczyński, who is native speaker, Polish speaker. And so they worked, three of them. And in that way, they translated poems with rhymes, sometimes very well.
Does much of your poetry rhyme in Polish? There's a real lyricism to the English translation. I wonder how much of it actually rhymes in the original
I don't quite hear.
He said there's a great deal of lyricism in the English, but he was wondering whether or not the poetry rhymes in Polish.
Yes. Yes, in Polish, rhymed poems, of course, cannot be reproduced in English. First of all, English is a very poor language, poor in rhymes. And rhyme has different function slightly in English. So, for instance, that poem, Naive, written in 1943 in Warsaw, The World, somehow Pinsky and Haas tried to render it in English. But I was not satisfied because it was too far from a childish character of the original. And that preserve that childish character with using rhymes, practically impossible.
You have a more literal translation.
More literal, yes.
Yes.
Do the concepts of normal religion enter into your poetry in any way?
Do the concepts of formal. Do the concepts of formal religion enter into your poetry?
Formal?
Formal religion enter into your poetry.
I don't understand. Formal?
You said formal? Does Catholicism enter into your poetry in any way?
Oh yes, oh yes. Oh yes, but the trouble is that writing religious poetry in the 20th century is very difficult.
You've had a little bit of a dialogue with the Pope about this.
Yes, I had a conversation with the present Pope, who reproached me. Well, he said, you make one step forward, one step back. And I answered, Holy Father, how in the 20th century one can write differently religious poetry? That what?
And what did he say?
He smiled.
I think maybe one more question. Sir. Yeah.
In the land of Ulro, you take up an argument with the scientific world is essentially empirical. I was wondering if you believe there is, say, a science that is not, that's okay. I've always been drawn to the fact that Hermes was both the inventor of the lyre and the father of sciences. I'm wondering if there's something, a science you think might be added
The question was, in the prose book, The Land of Ulro, you addressed the problem of scientism, and I think your question was whether or not there is a science that is appealing to you other than the strictly empirical kind. Which I didn't get a chance to ask you about this. Your interest in Einstein.
Yes.
You wrote a poem
Yeah.
to Einstein. Is the science of Einstein something that you disassociate from traditional empirical science?
This is a very, very large subject. I knew Einstein, and I had an attitude of worship towards him for some reasons, special reasons I am going to mention. But when I met him, we talked about some practical problems and my personal problems. At that time, Einstein was convinced that the world goes towards destruction because of atomic weapons, and that the only way out was to create the world government, which would control the weapons. And he wrote a paper in that spirit. And through his friend, Professor Nathan, sent to the Congress for Peace in Wrocław, in Poland, in 1948. That Congress was just a sort of a front for Stalin's armaments. And the Russians opposed reading that memo. But at that time I had to deal with that with Einstein, and I asked Einstein what I could do, whether I should go back to Poland or stay abroad and so on. I was very frank. But that's not the reason I worshipped him. I worshipped him because of my cousin, French poet, Oscar Milosz, who discovered theory of relativity, but in a mystical way, before he has read Einstein. And he considered that the theory of relativity opens a new era of mankind, the era of harmony, reconciliation between science, religion, and art. Why? This is difficult to explain here. Mostly because the consequence of Einstein's discovery is to get rid of Newtonian time as infinite element and space as infinite. I mean, introducing relativity of time and space, like in the Big Bang, a moment when there was no time and no space. So for that reason, I approached Einstein with enormous, practically cult, and I have written a poem about Einstein.
Yes. I think we should thank Mr. Milosz very much for spending so much time with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. 92nd Street Y Unterberg Poetry Center webcasts and access to our archive are made possible by a generous gift in memory of Christopher Lightfoot Walker, longtime friend of the Poetry Center and the Paris Review. For more information on 92nd Street Y and the Paris Review, please visit us on the web. This program is copyright 1993 by 92nd Street Y and the Paris Review.